This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Selling your car should feel like one less thing on your list, not one more. With Carvana, it is. Just go to Carvana.com, enter your license plate or VIN, and get a real offer down to the penny. No back and forth, no surprises, just an experience you can trust. Like your offer? Accept it. Schedule pickup, and we'll come to you with a check in hand. Your car, your timeline, your terms. Visit Carvana.com to sell your car today. Carvana. Delivery fees and terms may apply.
SpringFest is heating up at Lowe's. And for a limited time, we have the extra big deals you need to impress guests. Get your outdoor space ready and save $50 on a select Cobalt 24-volt blower kit, now $79. Plus, save $80 on a Charbroil Performance 4-burner grill, now $199. It's springtime, and our best lineup is here at Lowe's. Valid through 4/13. While supplies last. Selection varies by location.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. So hopefully you are not starting with episode 2 of this 3-part series, but if you are, I invite you to pause and go back to part 1 because we covered the beginning of John C. Calhoun's career through his tenure as Secretary of War in the Monroe administration. But now we are getting to the start of his vice presidency in 1825. And as with episode 1, I am joined not only by my vice presidency's co-host, Alex, but also by special guest, Alicia from Civics and Coffee. Alex, Alicia, thank you so much for joining me for part 2 of Calhoun.
I'm having a blast. Let's keep it going.
That's right. It's a party up in here.
Neither one of you is running for the hills just yet, even though we've had some questionable moments already.
Sure, that trend will continue.
Yes, it will. Yes, it will.
It makes it spicy.
Like this Bloody Mary.
Exactly.
Good.
K-pop Demon Hunters Haja Boys breakfast meal and Huntrix meal have just dropped at McDonald's. They're calling this a battle for the fans. What do you say to that, Rumi?
It's not a battle. So glad the Saja Boys could take breakfast and give our meal the rest of the day.
It is an honor to share.
No, it's our honor.
It is a larger honor.
No, really. Stop.
You can really feel the respect in this battle. Pick a meal to pick a side.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating McDonald's while supplies last.
So, we are at March 4th, 1825. Calhoun made his way to the Senate chamber where the oldest member of that body, who turned out to be none other than Senator Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. Yes, that's right. Andrew Jackson, who came up so much in part 1. He was a general. He invaded Florida. Calhoun was against him in cabinet deliberations, but he made sure that Jackson didn't find out. And then he was like, oh, you know what? I really wanted you to be president when my presidential run went nowhere. So Senator Andrew Jackson administered the oath of office to Calhoun for him to become the 7th vice president of the United States. Now, with the Senate out of session, as there was nothing else for a vice president to do at that time, the Calhouns returned to their home in South Carolina in early April, a trip that took nearly 2 weeks to get there due to, quote, bad roads and a lame horse. Calhoun found during this visit to the upstate the longest that he had taken since 1819 because the Secretary of War had much more to do than the vice president. So he found on this visit that the tariff of 1824 was highly unpopular in the region and was blamed for the economic strain that planters in the area were facing. We don't want to go into it too much in this episode, but just know that this was a highly unpopular tariff, and it would become a point that the Adams administration would be a wall that they'd hit time and time again. Calhoun also found that he was under increasing criticism in his home state, with Thomas Cooper, the president of South Carolina College, having published a pamphlet the previous fall, which was critical of Calhoun and his previous support of internal improvements. The Calhouns returned to Washington in October so that John could take up his duties of presiding over the Senate in the new congressional session. Now, Calhoun quickly made it clear that he intended to be much more involved as president of the Senate than had his predecessors. So, unlike Tompkins, who, as we discussed, Alex, was often absent from the presiding chair, and when he was there, he quite possibly was drunk.
A little bit. A little tipple.
Calhoun made sure that he was there every day the Senate was in session. So he's actually doing the limited job that the vice president has. Yay! Calhoun also availed himself of a power entitled to his role, but that his predecessors had not exercised. This vice president would appoint committees. Naturally, Adams and the administration's supporters would accuse Calhoun of using this power to undermine pro-administration legislation, and the Senate would change its rules to take away this power from the vice president. But this was something, and we'll see in Henry Clay's Seat at the Table episode, this was how he changed the office of House Speaker from something that was just kind of behind the scenes, nobody really knew who the Speaker was, to being the leading force in the House. Calhoun was wanting to use the same power in the Senate to be able to shape the work of the Senate. Now, back home in South Carolina, however, the state legislature revived a series of resolutions that had been narrowly defeated once more, ones which criticized Calhoun's prior nationalist viewpoints. This time they were approved, quote, by overwhelming majorities. So, problems back at home. That spring, Calhoun's one-time enemy, John Randolph of Roanoke, now a senator from Virginia, launched an all-out verbal attack on the Adams administration. You can count on John Randolph of Roanoke to attack whoever is president at the time.
Again, at least he's consistent.
He is very consistent. I don't care who is president, I'm going to oppose them. And so he is just going off. Now, I mentioned that Calhoun was wanting to take more control over the Senate, and he's supposed to preside over the Senate, which means that he can make rulings on, Senate business. While Calhoun is sitting there presiding over the Senate and Randolph is in his tirades, Calhoun does nothing. As described by Adams biographer James Traub about a particularly virulent speech on March 30th, quote, Vice President Calhoun, presiding over the Senate, had sat silently as Randolph's wild polemic poured forth like lava.
There's that volcanic analogy.
There we go. We are in the volcano. Now, continuing the quote, allies of the administration were outraged. It was widely and probably correctly believed that the vice president had helped Van Buren orchestrate the attack. Further, on March 30th, 1826, Calhoun interjected twice when Senator Mahlon Dickerson of New Jersey attempted to interrupt Randolph. So Calhoun attempted to justify his shielding of Randolph in a statement to the Senate on April 15th, quote, that after careful study of the Senate's rules, he believed that only other senators, not the vice president, had the right to call a fellow senator to order for words spoken in debate. Dickerson himself came to Calhoun's defense in a piece published on April 25th in the Daily National Intelligencer that asserted, quote, that the vice president had managed the situation exactly according to Senate rules. But it's clear that there is some favoritism going on here. On May 1st, a letter using the pseudonym Patrick Henry was published in the National Journal, asserting that Calhoun had, quote, advocated the single most important and self-evident function of a presiding officer of a deliberative body, the preservation of order. It also accused Calhoun of being, quote, the residuary legatee of General Jackson's pretensions to the presidency, and compared Calhoun to one of his predecessors, Aaron Burr.
Oh, shots fired.
Oh,
yeah. Patrick Henry is coming out full guns blazing.
So I'm wondering if we should nickname Calhoun Burr in the Saddle Part 2. I don't know. Let's see where we go. I've still not yet nicknamed this dude.
You haven't nicknamed him yet.
I don't know where to go with it.
In an era where dueling was the way most men handled their differences, my hats off to Patrick Henry for
right?
having some fortitude in going after Calhoun.
That's right.
Yes. I wasn't able to find out who was using this pseudonym Patrick Henry, but Calhoun and his supporters thought that the letter was from none other than President John Quincy Adams himself.
Whew!
Wow.
Which John Quincy Adams is one who he has times that he doesn't pull his punches, so
maybe.
Yep.
Thus, Calhoun felt justified in answering with an anonymous letter of using the pseudonym Onslow. He quote,
Oh, goodness gracious.
and yes, I know you're keeping up appearances. Onslow.
Okay.
For anybody who doesn't know Keeping Up Appearances, it's a great Britcom. There's a character named Onslow who is like the exact opposite of John C. Calhoun.
Yeah.
He does nothing.
He does. Absolutely not. Bone idle.
Bone
But
idle.
we digress.
Anyway, so he's writing this anonymous letter, and Calhoun, quote, vigorously defended his actions by referring to the Senate's constitutional right to set its own rules. Calhoun described the authority of the vice president as a quote-unquote umperage, a passive umpire rather than an active player. He's like, I'm not really supposed to do anything except just kind of give rulings, but I'm not in the midst of things. This back and forth resulted in 11 letters printed over the course of 5 months. Calhoun wrote 6 and quote-unquote Patrick Henry wrote 5. So there's definitely some tension.
A war of words.
A war of words.
It sounds like Calhoun had to get the last word in because he wrote 6. So.
Of course. Of course. Now, during his tenure as Secretary of War, the Calhouns, like the entire family, had resided in the D.C. area. They had decided because he's got to be there so often, why not just move the family there? But now as vice president, he doesn't have to be there as much. And so John and Floride talked about returning the family to South Carolina on a permanent basis. And Calhoun asked his brother-in-law to organize enslaved carpenters to repair Clergy Hall, which was the property that the widow Calhoun owned near Pendleton that would serve as a temporary home for the family until they could build a new one. Clergy Hall was originally, quote, a parsonage for the nearby Hopewell Kiowa Presbyterian Church and had been constructed in 1803. As for the home that they had in the D.C. area, Calhoun arranged for a friend to rent it, and the vice president later sold it for his mother-in-law at a loss. So she had bought that home for them and ended up selling it at a loss. The Calhouns would grow to love Clergy Hall so much that by December, they decided to make it their permanent home. But they would need to expand it, however, as the family also grew that year, with another son, James Edward, being born. So he's there a little longer, so we can understand it.
I was going to let it pass.
He's obviously not going to let it pass.
Apparently not. Now, the family would later joke that every time John left for Washington, Floride would add on another room to the house.
Well, it's an accurate assessment, I feel like.
I mean, another baby coming, need another room. Understandable. Now, despite these things going on with his family, the huge resettlement, Calhoun still had his mind on politics, and in June 1826 sent a letter to Andrew Jackson via John Eden expressing his support for Jackson and his cause. So Jackson was gearing up for another run for the presidency. Returning to Washington late in the year for the next congressional session, as Calhoun was alone, he moved into a boarding house. Now, soon after his return, Calhoun got word that rumors about alleged misconduct during his tenure in the War Department were being bandied around again.
Jesus.
Here we go again. If you want to attack Calhoun, attack his time as War Secretary. To answer the charges, the vice president, like his predecessor when faced with accusations of wrongdoing, quote, demanded a full investigation of the accusation by the House of Representatives. So he's like, let's just go ahead, get it all out there, go ahead and investigate me. After several weeks, the committee dismissed the charges, quote, despite the fact that it was composed by his enemies. So even though this committee was made up of people who didn't like him, they still couldn't find evidence of wrongdoing. They're like, okay, we got to let it go. Calhoun in February 1827 cast a tie-breaking vote, quote, to table a new tariff on woolens. This tariff, which would close the loophole in the 1824 tariff that would, quote, effectively eliminate any competition from abroad, was quite unpopular and seen as protectionism to benefit a small group at the expense of the wider public. As Elder notes, quote, Calhoun had little trouble deciding on his vote and did not feel the need to explain himself. However, just as the bill had its fervent opponents, it had equally passionate supporters, and they began to organize a convention to be held in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in July. Now, folks in the South were already beginning to interpret the push, quote, for tariffs and internal improvements as a threat to slavery. Some of these same folks even saw a threat in the American Colonization Society and its application that year, quote, for a federal appropriation as a threat aimed to turn the might of the federal government against slavery. Some leaders in South Carolina began to talk openly about disunion.
Ruh-roh.
Yeah, there is trouble. The sections are starting to divide. Even though talk at home was about disunion, Calhoun was not in support of it at this point. He did, however, understand there was a threat, because once the congressional session ended, Calhoun went home to Clergy Hall and on July 1st, 1827, wrote to a friend and colleague that, quote, I see a great crisis before us, which even the presidential election, important as it is, does not carry us over. In his public statements as well, Calhoun began to express his concern. He delivered a toast in Pendleton a couple of days later in which he toasted to, quote, the Constitution of the United States, intended for the protection and happiness of the whole, may it never be perverted into an instrument of monopoly and oppression. By late August, Calhoun had worked out the concept of, quote, a state veto on federal power, though he did express his concerns about its constitutionality when he wrote, quote, how far such a negative would be found consistent with general power is an important consideration, which I waive for the present. So I've come up with this idea. I don't know if it's constitutional or not. I'm just not going to think about it right now. Yes. All right. That's the choice. As the election year of 1828 neared, behind the scenes, Calhoun attempted to organize his protégés and keep them aligned behind Jackson's candidacy for president. So he is going all in for Jackson.
Where's Patrick Henry when you need him, right? Where's this guy?
Where is he? Where is he? Calhoun likewise had the support of one of Jackson's key campaign organizers, Senator Martin Van Buren of New York, for him to remain vice president under the new administration. So he's like, you know what? I'd be able to get along with these new folks better than I can Adams and his folks. Let's see if we can just slide back on into the vice presidency. Van Buren was concerned that New York Governor DeWitt Clinton, one of Van Buren's political rivals, was angling for the spot at the bottom of the ticket. And he is like, no, I'm not having my political rival get to the vice presidency. Not again. We're not having that. So Calhoun and Van Buren met at the end of 1826 to plan on how to align their efforts in support of Jackson. Van Buren was able to get diehard former Crawford supporters to hold their nose and support Calhoun for a second term as VP under Jackson. This did not mean that Van Buren's support for Calhoun was perpetual. Indeed, Calhoun biographer Elder speculates that Van Buren had already learned by this point, possibly from Crawford himself, who Van Buren had previously supported in 1824, he had learned of Calhoun's previous opposition to Jackson during cabinet deliberations in the Monroe administration. So Calhoun had tried to keep all that quiet. Now it's coming around and it's going to make its way to Jackson.
Andy Jack, don't play.
Now, whether it was from Van Buren or another source, somehow a letter from Monroe to Calhoun during the Florida crisis in 1818, which we discussed last episode, disappeared from Calhoun's records of his correspondence and ended up with Jackson.
Bum, bum, bum.
which revealed the presence of criticism of Jackson in the deliberations of the Monroe cabinet at the time. Now, Calhoun first corresponded back and forth with Monroe for them to get their stories straight. Then he wrote to Jackson to try to explain and smooth things out. I promise. You're just, folks are trying to separate us. Don't do that. We're cool.
I already know his nickname. I got it.
What is it?
The Cunning Calhoun.
Ooh.
Cunning
That's
Calhoun. That's it. All right. Meanwhile, in the spring of 1828, in his official capacity as president of the Senate, Calhoun cast a tie-breaking vote in order to push forward, quote, an amendment to dramatically restrict appropriations for internal improvements. So he had been so pro-internal improvements up through his time as Secretary of War, and now he's turning against them because Jackson's against them. Jackson's supporters are against them. When attacked for this supposed change in his ideology, Calhoun countered in a speech on April 10th that his only objection was that internal improvements were not being pushed forward with, quote, a comprehensive plan which opened up the danger of appropriations in their supposed favor, quote, being made subservient to political combinations. So basically he was saying they don't want to put together a full plan for this because they want to fill this with pork. They want to be able to say, oh, well, my district's going to get this and my district's going to get that. And was there some of that happening? Probably. But was he really doing this out of ideology or to curry favor?
Yeah.
The big fight, however, was coming in the form of a new tariff bill. Van Buren had his ally, Senator Silas Wright, Democratic Republican from New York, put forward a new tariff bill that would answer some of the demands of the Harrisburg Convention by, quote, dramatically raising duties on a whole raft of manufactured and raw materials in an effort to win support from both Northern and Western representatives. Now, Van Buren didn't really intend to have this bill pass. He convinced Calhoun to urge his supporters in the House, quote, to vote against amendments removing some of the bill's most objectionable figures in the hopes that this would drive some Adams men from New York to vote against it alongside Southerners, thus dooming the bill to failure. In a political game of smoke and mirrors, this result would allow Northern Jackson supporters like Van Buren to support the bill as their constituents want it, and would cast Adams and his supporters as opposed to their constituents' will, while the Southerners would get what they wanted in the defeat of the tariff. Everybody play their part, and this is all going to work out.
Political theater at its finest.
Unfortunately, with schemes like this, things seldom go according to plan, and some representatives from New England voted for the tariff to pass in late April. Thus, in early May, the Senate took up the bill. Van Buren decided the best course now was to, quote, support amendments in the Senate that soothed New England's objections and assured the bill's final passage with the provisions most hated by the South still intact. So when it came up for a vote and Van Buren announced his support, Calhoun and the Southern senators knew they had been had. Calhoun wrote to a friend from college afterwards that, quote, I certainly have had great difficulties to contend with, but truth will in the long run prevail. I've ever relied on it as my only guide under every difficulty. I know not that it is even a merit in me. I cannot do otherwise. Whether it be too great confidence in my own opinion, I cannot say. But what I think I see with so much apparent clearness as not to leave me a choice to pursue any other course, which has always given me the impression that I acted under the force of destiny.
Oh, God.
It's a little hyperbolic, but okay.
Yes.
With such an impression, I meet with clearness all events. Let what will come. Yeah, that doesn't sound like a recipe for disaster in the future.
Nah, what could go wrong?
Because he got played. He's usually a player.
What could go wrong?
Yeah.
Calhoun returned to South Carolina in May and was immediately met with indignation about the tariff, which opponents were taking to calling the Tariff of Abominations. Leaders in South Carolina, including Calhoun's protege, Representative George McDuffie, were vocal in their opposition, with McDuffie even, quote, proposing a counter tariff on Northern goods as a response. Calhoun gave his own tempered response in a toast at the 4th of July dinner in Pendleton. Quote, the Congress of 76. They taught the world how oppression could be successfully resisted. May the lesson teach rulers that their only safety is in justice and moderation. Indeed, his friends in other parts of the nation wrote to Calhoun that summer, urging him to steer clear of the more radical opponents of the tariff for fear of his future opportunities for political advancement being damaged by association. They were like, you don't want to be considered with the radicals. That's not going to play well anywhere else outside of South Carolina. So don't do it. For his part, Calhoun wrote to assure his friends in other parts of the nation to South Carolina's attachment to the Union, though he did assert that he understood the concerns of his neighbors and colleagues in the Palmetto State, as his plantation operations too were suffering and not being profitable due to tariffs. Calhoun worked to gather his thoughts through the summer and fall in a small building that he had constructed behind Clergy Hall, which would serve as his office. When he received a request in early November from the Speaker of the South Carolina House of Representatives for his thoughts on the tariff and the idea of a state veto, or, as we know of it, nullification, Calhoun was ready. Initially called the South Carolina Exposition, Calhoun's anonymous broadside entitled Exposition and Protest was published before the year was out. As noted by Elder, quote, it marked an intellectual as well as political departure for Calhoun, and the first clear example of the theoretical brilliance Calhoun was capable of when he sensed a visceral, systematic threat. His most innovative and potentially destructive arguments in the years ahead would be produced from a defensive posture. So when his back is against the wall, that's when he comes out swinging. Calhoun marked a difference between levying tariffs to bring in revenue for the nation and levying tariffs strictly to protect manufacturing industries. The former was constitutional in Calhoun's mind. The latter was not. Further, as there was no benefit for Southerners, Calhoun argued that they would be forced to become manufacturers and thus would compete against those in the North rather than be their customers, which would lead to greater sectional conflict and disunion. With that in mind, Calhoun outlined how he felt nullification should be carried out. States would have to summon a special convention to implement the state's veto of a federal law. A state veto would then cause the federal government to seek, quote, to amend the Constitution in order to grant itself the power in question. If the Constitution was successfully changed in order to explicitly grant the federal government the power in question, then the state that it issued the veto would have to abide by the ruling. So we said this was wrong and unconstitutional. You change that, we're good. Calhoun rejected the idea of a state seceding from the Union after having the Constitution Amendment in a way that it didn't like. While Calhoun was technically correct that the idea of nullification was not new, this was the first time that someone had actually outlined how the process would work. So he wasn't completely new in thinking of this idea of the state veto, but he was planning out how step A, step B, step C, it would work. When the state speaker had the work published, he omitted the section in Calhoun's original draft calling for a state veto to originate with a special convention, and Calhoun would have to correct the record later. As noted by Elder, the exposition and protest does not represent Calhoun breaking with his nationalist ideology. Rather, quote, Calhoun was trying to find a way to preserve the structure of the Union consistent with the principle that the power ultimately resided in the people, although the people of the states. So he's really picking at straws here. He's trying to say, well, he's thinking of the Union, but he's thinking of the Union as a collection of states where the power is held by the people in the states.
But just some of the people.
But just some of the people. No,
That's
we don't
true.
want all the people.
Yeah.
Well, and just some of the men.
Just some of the men.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. But to his point, yes, he is trying to balance these national and state concerns. It's kind of shaky. By the time the exposition and protest was published, it was known that Jackson had defeated Adams for the presidency and that Calhoun would remain as vice president under the new administration. So the Calhouns, or at least John and Floride, traveled back to Washington for the lame duck session of the 20th Congress. To this point, Floride had been back at home, but with this incoming administration, things were abuzz in D.C., so apparently she decided, hey, there's stuff going on, the boy parties. I'd like to see what's going on and not just stay at home.
Someone else can take care of these kids.
Yeah.
Can take care of the kids. I'm not pregnant. Let's go.
Yeah.
But this meant that Floride Calhoun was present at their lodgings in early January when Senator John Eden of Tennessee and his new bride paid a call on her. And yes, Alicia, I think you know where this is going.
I sure do.
Little did anyone know that this courtesy call, which was standard for senators and their wives at the time, would throw the incoming administration into disarray before it even began.
Yep.
As we'll learn more about in Eden's Seat at the Table episode, the new Mrs. Eden, Margaret, or Peggy as she was known, was quite well known in Washington circles. She had previously been married to John Timberlake, who had died at sea under conflicting circumstances. Either he died of pneumonia or by suicide, and was buried on the Spanish island of Minorca. Nearly 9 months later, on January 1st, 1829, John Eden and Peggy were married. As you can imagine, tongues started wagging that they may have been involved prior to Timberlake's death, or that somehow Eden and his new wife had arranged for Timberlake's death. Peggy Eden was gossiped about as having numerous affairs going on around D.C. As described by Elder, quote, Margaret was vivacious, loud, uncommonly direct in her speech, and familiar with men in ways that made their wives uncomfortable. So she was self-assured and not afraid to speak to men. So naturally, that meant that she was sleeping with them.
Of course. Yes. She was a woman ahead of her time, and how dare she? So she needed to be put back in her place, right?
Yes.
A theme that would not repeat throughout history.
Not at all. We will never see this again.
Nope. One time only.
One time only. So with that in mind, this background, when the Edens showed up in the Calhoun's parlor that day, Floride was beside herself. The enslaved individual who had informed her that she had callers had not mentioned their names before she walked in. As described by Elder, quote, as the vice president's wife and thus one of the bellwethers of the social scene, Floride's decision would carry great weight. The custom as it went at that time was that the senator and his wife would call on the vice president and his wife, and then the wife of the vice president would return the social call. The day after the Edens' visit, however, Floride informed her husband that she would not pay a return call on the Edens.
Ooh.
And so it begins.
And so it begins because soon enough, quote, as Floride's decision rippled through Washington, other prominent socialites took her lead and also snubbed Margaret.
Such an interesting time for you to decide you want to be present with your husband.
Yes.
And how that simple decision had such a cascading effect, of which I'm sure we're about to dive into.
Yes, because as Calhoun was inaugurated to a second term as vice president on March 4th, and Jackson inaugurated as president, in the midst of all the social events associated with the inauguration, Peggy was treated as invisible by Washington society.
Ooh.
Rough.
The problem with this soon became evident when Jackson appointed John Eden as his Secretary of War. Now, the Calhouns and others were not just snubbing a senator's wife. Washington society was now snubbing the spouse of a cabinet member.
Yeah. What could go wrong?
What could go wrong?
I need popcorn.
This is the beginning of the Jackson presidency. So the Calhouns decided, you are vice president, right? Right. Congress isn't in session? Right? Right. Let's get out of here. So they decided, shortly after the inauguration, let's just go home to South Carolina. We're not sticking around.
Now that you've stirred the pot, you're going to go home.
Now that they stirred all of this up. Yep. We're gone. See y'all later. Have fun.
I might have to change it to cowardly and cunning. Stick to your guns. Come on.
In their absence, Jackson became an outspoken defender of Peggy Eden and her character and honor. Martin Van Buren, now Secretary of State in Jackson's new cabinet, used the situation to his advantage. As a widower, he made public social calls on the Edens and secured Jackson's favor. Van Buren was already in this early stage being talked about as a potential successor of Jackson to the presidency, and though we'll talk about this in more detail in Van Buren's episodes, it's always good to have a popular incumbent's support in a presidential run, especially when there's a vice president who just entered his second term who may also be a potential contender.
Bum, bum, bum.
Bum, bum, bum. Now, whether the idea came from or was nurtured by Van Buren or not, by the fall, though Jackson had initially blamed Henry Clay for organizing the snub of Peggy Eden, Jackson is always picking somebody else at random to be the one who does things.
And it's always wrong. I don't understand. Like, how do you get everything so wrong all of the time, sir?
Because he's so busy being calm. Maintaining.
That's right. He was meditating. That's right. I'm sorry.
He was meditating. Right. He couldn't keep up with political gossip. But anyway, he was definitely wrong in this, and somebody finally told him, because finally the president turned his fury on Calhoun.
Here it comes.
Accusing him of trying, quote, to eliminate Eden as a possible competitor for the presidency. Now, from afar, safely from afar, Calhoun monitored affairs in Washington, and through his ally, Samuel Ingham, who had been named as Secretary of the Treasury, the vice president was disappointed in many of Jackson's other appointments. As noted by Elder, there was a prevalence of, quote, old Crawford men who were now shifting their allegiances to Van Buren. Mm-hmm. So Calhoun is not picking up, Crawford is just out of the picture by this point. His supporters are trying to figure out who's next. He's not getting them. Van Buren is. Meanwhile, back in South Carolina, John and Florrie Calhoun welcomed into the world the last of their children, William Lowndes, in August 1829.
How many children had they had at this point?
Let's see.
Sorry.
I feel like at least 5, but
yeah, even more than that because I cut some out.
I'm going to go with 7.
What's your guess, Alicia?
Well, you said more than 5, so 9.
Close. 10.
Busy.
Yeah.
Very busy.
10.
So, but they are finally done with having kids. Due to her recently giving birth, Florrie would not accompany John back to Washington for the December opening of the first session of the 21st Congress.
Probably a good idea.
Yep.
But of course, there were some in the capital city who wondered if her absence was due to the controversy of the Edens. The last time you showed up in town, it didn't go well. Maybe just stay at home.
Stay home.
The vice president was accompanied by their eldest son, Andrew, who would continue on from there to begin his studies at his father's alma mater, Yale. If Calhoun and his supporters hoped that the new president would support them in their opposition to the Tariff of Abominations, however, his annual message to Congress on December 8, 1829, would make it very clear that he was not. Jackson only advocated for minor alterations of the tariff and shared that he intended for the tariff to help pay off the national debt, which was one of Jackson's main priorities as president.
Yeah.
However, instead of calling for an end to the tariff once the debt was paid off, Jackson put forward the idea of redistributing government profits to states on the basis of, quote, representation in Congress. So he's like, why would we give up that revenue stream when we can take that money and send it to the states so that they can support projects in their respective states? Now, we'll talk more about this in Webster's episode, But the beginning of 1830 would witness a famous debate on the floor of the Senate between Senators Robert Hayne, Jacksonian from South Carolina, and Daniel Webster, National Republican from Massachusetts. Hayne defended states' rights and the idea of nullification, while Webster delivered his famous Liberty and Union speech. While Calhoun did not have any direct role in this debate, it would lead to what happened at the Jefferson Day dinner on April 13, 1830. Jackson and Calhoun were both present for the event, along with over 100 other folks, including many congressmen, at the Indian Queen Hotel in Washington. The tension ratcheted up as they went through their prepared toast, including that of Robert Hayne to, quote, the Union of the States and the sovereignty of the states, to the point that the Pennsylvania delegation walked out. So they can't even toast anymore without it turning into a thing. When it came time for volunteers to give toast, Jackson stood and delivered a 6-word toast that made it clear where he stood on the idea of nullification. The legend is that he looked straight at Calhoun. He said, quote, our union, it must be preserved.
Can we just pause for a minute? That is like a mic drop of a comment, right? Like, I'm not a fan of Jackson for a number of reasons, but man knew how to let his intentions be known and just boop, done.
Oh, yeah. And a very succinct statement.
Yes.
Mic drop.
6 words, very clear. And Calhoun, I'm looking straight at you.
It's not here.
Because I'd throw something at her.
The real politicians of Washington, D.C.
The reality show that is the Jackson presidency. Now, once Jackson sat, it was Calhoun's turn.
No.
He rose and offered the toast, quote, the Union, next to our liberty most dear. May we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states and distributing equally the benefit and burdens of the Union.
What a wet blanket.
Yeah.
Not nearly as catchy.
No.
I can only imagine the look that Jackson would give it to.
Right? And if he had a gun, you're one word away from a duel.
Yeah. I mean, Andrew Jackson loved his dueling.
Yeah, he did. Weirdo.
Yeah. And don't attempt to assassinate him because he has a cane.
Yes.
He'll fight those bullets off.
He'll beat you with it, literally. So with this, the break between Jackson and Calhoun was complete. As we discussed in Crawford's episode of the Seat at the Table series, soon enough, Crawford was supplying information to Jackson to confirm that Calhoun, during his tenure as Secretary of War, had argued for Jackson to be, quote, punished in some form for his conduct in Florida.
It's on.
Mm-hmm.
It's on.
Gloves are off.
Yes.
Because, a month after that Jefferson Day dinner and the toast, on May 13th, 1830, Jackson sent a letter to Calhoun with Crawford's letter included, quote, demanding an explanation, as Calhoun had previously assured Jackson of his support when he was Secretary of War.
Bum,
Right,
bum,
see,
bum.
yourself out of this one. Come on,
You can picture that.
Yeah, that cunning's not going to do you any favors, man. It's a roost.
No. Calhoun expressed his, quote, indignation at the affair and the, quote, secret and mysterious attempts to injure my character, and immediately got to work gathering information for his defense. He consulted with Monroe, former Attorney General William Wirt, and Postmaster General William Barry to gather data. On May 29th, he made his formal reply to Jackson, knowing that this letter, or at least its contents, would likely be made public soon enough. He began defiantly asserting, quote, I wish to be distinctly understood that, however high my respect is for your personal character and the exalted station which you occupy, I cannot recognize the right on your part to call in question my conduct on the interesting occasion to which your letter refers. I acted on that occasion in the discharge of a high official duty and under responsibility to my conscience and my country only.
Very interesting, because that wasn't what Jackson was pissed about, not you doing your duty. It was you said you had my support as the Secretary of the War Department, and I'm finding out, actually, that you lied to me. So I think it's the lie, dear sir, not whether or not you upheld your duties. But way to obfuscate the issue.
Exactly. He's trying to avoid addressing that because for all of his research, he lied to him.
There comes that cunning word again, evasion and deceit.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
He's going to get the cane after you.
Especially since a close advisor of Jackson said that he had never seen the president as angry as he was after reading Calhoun's letter.
Mm.
And that's saying something.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that Jackson is the model of, calm. He really had a big temper. In his reply, he wrote that, quote, I never expected to have occasion to say of you, in the language of Caesar, et tu, Brute.
Oof.
Ooh. Jeez. Jackson is drawing out the Latin.
Yeah.
Ooh. Meanwhile, Calhoun returned home to South Carolina.
It's like, and that's my cue to leave. I'm out. I'll catch you guys later. Make sure that man doesn't have any bullets when I get back. All right, great. Thanks. Bye.
Somebody please distract him. I'm gone.
Take away his cane.
So he returned home. He delivered remarks at a 4th of July dinner in Pendleton, in which he issued a warning about, quote, consolidation and disunion, the two extremes of our system. So he's saying we don't want to be too much together. We don't want to be apart. Middle ground. Middle ground. Now, it should be noted that it was during this trip that Calhoun began to refer to his home that was previously known as Clergy Hall as Fort Hill. It would be this moniker that the home, which is located on the Clemson University campus and that Alex and I have been to, is known by to this day. But, folks think, this is the time that he felt under siege. And so it's interesting that he renames his home after a Revolutionary era fort located in the area. Calhoun's friends in other parts of the nation urged him to use his influence to quell the increasingly radical turn in South Carolina politicians. But the vice president pointed the responsibility for the situation back at President Jackson. He's like, it's his fault. He is the one to blame. Not me. Not my friends. It's him.
Mealy mouth.
Yes. So Calhoun knew that Jackson would be coming for him, as Calhoun was seen as a contender for the presidency. So he decided that to get ahead of the attack, he had, quote, to publish all the correspondence on the Seminole War between himself and Jackson.
That's a vibe.
Calhoun asked Representative John Quincy Adams to review the documents and even had the collection sent via Secretary of War John Eden to put before Jackson prior to publication in order to give him a courtesy heads up. Unfortunately for Calhoun, Eden for some reason did not show them to Jackson.
Can't imagine why.
Why wouldn't he like Calhoun?
I feel like they were so tight in the beginning of the administration.
That courtesy thing?
Yeah.
The wives got along so well.
I mean, what went wrong?
Dang.
So naturally, Jackson was irate when he saw the correspondence published in the United States Telegraph on February 17th, 1831. Yeah.
Just keep digging your grave, bro.
Digging. By March 1831, Calhoun was back on his way to South Carolina and on the way attended a dinner. Yes, he's going back home. He's like, I gotta get.
Let me take my leave, dear sir.
Bye, everybody. I'm gone.
I'll send you a postcard.
Just gonna throw this bomb in the room and then bye.
I'm out.
I'm out. So on the way, he attended a dinner thrown by Virginia Governor John Floyd, who told Calhoun that he had his support over Jackson for the presidency. Calhoun also made a stop in Columbia, South Carolina to rally support with nullification supporters there, outlining his plans to push for, quote, a constitutional amendment to give the West the internal improvements it sought, reduce the tariff to levels sufficient to provide revenue for the federal government, but keeping high duties on the most important manufactured goods, and, of course, giving the South free trade. Sounds like a presidential platform to me, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
No, those are just some good ideas.
Just some good ideas put together in a succinct proposal. Whatever.
He's good at firing those flaming arrows as he's kind of like in the premises. It's just like,
yes.
Ooh, man. Well, he thinks he's good.
He thinks he's good.
Stand corrected.
Because meanwhile, increasing concern from supporters from other parts of the nation came into Calhoun as his protege, Representative George McDuffie, upped his rhetoric by delivering a speech at a dinner in Charleston against, quote, the Union, such as the majority have made it. So people who are really close to him are really liking this idea of disunion. Despite increasing indications from Jackson that he would oppose nullification, Calhoun resolved himself to the ideological course which he had plotted. Not trying for disunion, guys, I promise, but I am in support of nullification. Thus, Calhoun composed what has come to be known as his Fort Hill Address in July 1831. This address was first published in the Pendleton Messenger in its August 3rd issue. Intending to be moderate, Calhoun in this address committed to his idea that the states were independent nations who had agreed to be joined together in a confederation. In a nod to Madison's If Men Were Angels concept in the Federalist Papers, Calhoun asserted his belief that a day would come when, quote, all the guards of liberty may be dispensed with, but until then, he felt that the states would have to serve as the safeguard of liberty. The Fort Hill Address, published under his name, would be widely distributed in pamphlets and newspapers across the nation. As noted by Elder, quote, it would become a part of Calhoun's legend that he turned his back on his own presidential ambitions for the sake of his native region and state. Now, this overstates what Calhoun knew at the time, but certainly he realized it would not help his chances.
Yeah.
Also, at the end of the year, Calhoun returned to Washington, D.C. to preside over the Senate, and he likely took great joy in being called upon to break a tie-breaking vote early in 1832. Now, in order to move forward from the Petticoat Affair, which was the whole people didn't want to accept Peggy Eden, Jackson said support Peggy Eden, they said no. Jackson asked all of his cabinet to resign, including his erstwhile Secretary of State, Barton Van Buren. And Jackson and Van Buren had come up with this idea, just go ahead and clear house, then you can bring in new folks, it'll clear the air. Jackson then proceeded to appoint Van Buren as U.S. Minister to Britain in a recess appointment. Without waiting for the appointment to be made permanent by Senate confirmation, Van Buren proceeded to London. Naturally, they're going to approve this nomination. When the nomination went forward to the Senate, however, that body split in their vote, which meant that Vice President Calhoun was the deciding vote.
Can't imagine how this is going to go.
Yeah. Van Buren, got some bad news for you. Now, despite the efforts of Representative John Quincy Adams, National Republican from Massachusetts, to push through a compromise tariff which would quell the talk of nullification, neither Calhoun nor the other nullifiers were satisfied. Thus, Calhoun returned to South Carolina in July and set to work to fulfill a public request from South Carolina Governor James Hamilton Jr., quote, to elaborate on his views about nullification. This work was released in late August and expanded on his previous thoughts in the exposition and the Fort Hill Address. The nullifiers in South Carolina would come out victorious during elections in October, and on November 24th, at a convention called for by the state legislature, both the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 were nullified. The convention proclaimed that as of February 1st, 1833, the tariffs would no longer be enforced in the state. If the federal administration sought to have them enforced, then South Carolina would be justified in seceding from the Union.
And so the seed is planted.
Yes.
So the seed is planted. that dark seed of disunion. Knowing that this was setting up a showdown with President Jackson, the South Carolina State Legislature appointed one of their senators, Robert Hayne, as governor, and then chose Calhoun on December 12th to serve in the Senate for the remainder of Haynes' term. As he could not hold both posts simultaneously, and knowing that his tenure as vice president was going to end in a few months anyway, because naturally he had been dropped as Jackson's running mate in favor of Van Buren, in order to take his seat in the Senate, Calhoun submitted his resignation as vice president on December 28th and departed for Washington, D.C.
Bye, Felicia.
Although this was kind of a bye, Felicia, hi, Felicia, new hat. But yes, so this will have ramifications for us discussing his vice presidency because, of course, he did not complete that second term fully, which will impact his score for vice presidencies. It will also mean that we will have another president pro tempore episode coming up because somebody would have to preside over the Senate. You can't just have the seat vacant. But the new senator from South Carolina took his seat in the Senate chamber January 4th, 1833. I'm picturing him walking in and just kind of, by routine, starting up towards the dais, and then, oh, that's right. Oh,
I got to sit over here.
I'm over there. Sorry, everybody. I thought somebody had taken my seat. We're good.
I can only imagine the looks that he was getting from, his.
Yeah, kind of awkward.
Like, who the heck is this guy? I think he is,
Kind of awkward.
Yeah.
It would not be long before he took the opportunity to speak. Calhoun making a speech. Wow.
No.
That never happened. So, on January 16th, Senator Felix Grundy, Democrat from Tennessee, read a message from the president, quote, requesting Congress to authorize him to enforce the collection of tariff revenue. When Calhoun rose to speak, quote, there was hushed silence in the Senate chamber, and the deep emotion of the speaker was reflected in the faces of his auditors. Calhoun passionately attacked the proposal of the force bill, asserting that, quote, we are threatened to have our throats cut and those of our wives and children.
Drama queen much?
Such hyperbole.
Yeah.
As Calhoun did that, he wrote back to South Carolina urging leaders there to, quote, give no pretext for force. Thus, on January 21st, the Nullification Convention met again in Charleston and voted to delay putting the nullification into effect and expressed, quote, that they were willing to pay lower duties if Congress passed them. Back in Washington, Senator Henry Clay, National Republican from Kentucky, met with Calhoun to discuss a potential compromise to defuse the situation and how to do it in such a way that Jackson would get no credit for resolving this issue, because Clay was not a fan of Jackson either. They didn't want him to get any credit, but we got to walk this one back. The day after Clay announced his compromise bill on February 11th, Calhoun rose in the Senate to express his support. This did not mean, however, that Calhoun was going to let the issue of the force bill go, as that bill continued to progress through the Senate. On February 15th, Calhoun began a 2-day speech attacking the force bill, as well as President Jackson and Jackson's unexpected ally, Senator Daniel Webster. Webster wasn't really a fan of Jackson either, but he was a fan of the Union and didn't like this whole nullification and secession talk. Now, the crux of Calhoun's argument can be summed up in the following quote. You cannot keep the states united in the constitutional and federal bonds by force. Force may indeed hold the parts together, but such union would be the bond between master and slave, a union of exaction on one side and of unqualified obedience on the other.
Hot meat kettle. Come on.
Right.
Yeah.
God.
The irony of him saying this. When Webster rose in response and asserted, quote, that if Calhoun was right about the compact theory, he was right about everything, Calhoun had the Secretary of the Senate read excerpts from Webster's debate with Senator Haynes a few years earlier, in which he referred to the Constitution as being a quote-unquote compact and a quote-unquote bargain. When Webster realized his own words were being used against him, he sat down. Though Calhoun had successfully taken on Webster, he was ultimately unsuccessful in defeating the force bill, which passed on March 1st along with Clay's compromise tariff. Calhoun, as you can imagine, did not stay in Washington to see Jackson and Van Buren's inauguration. Instead, returning home to South Carolina to be on hand as the Nullification Convention met on March 11th to repeal the original nullification ordinance, as well as nullify the force bill. Despite this last thrust at Jackson, this would prove to be the end of the nullification crisis. There was no reason to use the force bill, so it's just kind of there, not really need it. Jackson didn't press the issue, so Calhoun was able to focus on personal matters during this congressional recess. In November 1833, Calhoun, with a brief stopover in Charleston to deliver remarks at the cornerstone laying of a monument, would travel back to Washington, D.C. for the next congressional session. As described by Elder, though, Calhoun had managed to secure his control over the political scene in South Carolina at this point. But, quote, in Washington, Calhoun found himself the leader of a small but powerful minority of nullifiers and state rights advocates who were aligned with neither the Jackson administration nor the powerful opposition associated with Henry Clay. So, for longtime listeners, you may remember that term, the tertium quids, the third way, kind of rebuilding that. It's this minority that's the minority of the minority, but still a powerful force. Despite his being a small minority, Calhoun was still a key leader in Washington, and he started to exert this influence on January 13, 1834, when he stood to express his thoughts on Henry Clay's measures, quote, to censure the president for his impulsive removal of the deposits from the Bank of the United States. Calhoun was in favor of the censure, and in his remarks, quote, dissected and dismissed the constitutional arguments of Secretary of the Treasury Roger Taney. Calhoun would also support Webster's unsuccessful bill, quote, to continue the charter of the Bank of the United States for another 6 years, attempting to appeal both to hard money advocates and the banking interests. So again, kind of what Jackson did was wrong, but I don't support the bank. Third way. Warning of the danger of the proliferation of paper money from various banks across the nation, Calhoun urged that the Bank of the United States could help, quote, in restraining other banks in order to ensure a solid currency. And this goes back to what we discussed in episode 1 when he was supporting the Second Bank of the United States. It's not about having a national bank per se, it's about regulating the currency. He feels that that is the constitutionality of the national bank. In this congressional term, Calhoun would also work to repeal the force bill. He wasn't letting that one go. Despite the fact that it was set to expire in just a few weeks' time, in April 1834, Calhoun launched into the battle without success. Everybody else is like, dude, it's about to expire. What are you talking about? No, we need to repeal it. No, we don't. Now, Calhoun was more successful in convincing the Senate in a 25-17 vote, quote, to formally refuse a message from Jackson protesting the Senate's decision to censure him over the removal of deposits. Now, we should note that in this time of political realignment with supporters of Adams, Clay, and Webster forming the Whig coalition against Jackson, Calhoun continued to think of himself and refer to himself as a nullifier. Now, I've seen in some accounts of the history of this time that they've referred to him as a Whig. I don't think he was ever a Whig.
Yeah.
But he wasn't a Democrat because he wasn't supporting Jackson.
Right.
He was this third thing, a nullifier thing. It's the third thing.
The third thing.
Yeah. The third option.
The third option in his volcano layer. Now, with the end of the Senate session in May 1834, Calhoun returned home. But when he returned to the nation's capital in late 1834, he was accompanied by Floride, their 17-year-old daughter, Anna, and their young son, William Lowndes. Now, as a young adult, Anna was thrilled by the opportunity and enjoyed watching Senate proceedings from the gallery. For the next few years, Anna would join her father for the trip to Washington for each congressional session, even when her mother stayed at home.
Oh.
Now, beyond just providing companionship for Calhoun, Anna would inspire her father to participate more in the Washington social scene. So she's helping him to get out there, meet folks, but she's becoming very close to her father. On July 29th, 1835, an event occurred in Washington that would become a new cause célèbre for Calhoun. The American Anti-Slavery Society attempted to send pamphlets promoting their cause to South Carolina. When local enslavers learned of this, 2,000 of them gathered, confiscated the pamphlets, and burned them. So this is official U.S. mail that they are burning. Then, as now, that is a big federal crime. While leaders in Charleston worked to keep order, over 150 anti-abolition meetings were held across the South, one of which was at Farmers Hall in Pendleton on September 9th. This meeting elected Calhoun to a 20-member committee, quote, to write a report and resolutions on the crisis. Their report denounced abolitionists as, quote, fanatics of the North, and asserted that they were working, quote, for the destruction of the people of neighboring sovereignties.
Well, okay, that's one way to think about it.
But also, y'all just burnt
mail.
Okay. This report also dismissed the horrors of slavery, describing the institution as, quote, a happy, patriarchal state in which in benevolence and kindness of the master and the fidelity and affection of the slave combine in the most bland and harmonious manner.
Oh, for the love of Pete.
Harmonious. Hashtag cringe.
Yeah.
Hashtag big cringe.
Hashtag cray-cray.
Whew.
This committee put forward resolutions calling on, quote, the federal government to restrict the transmission of incendiary material through the mail, and incendiary by the actual contents, not the fact that it's paper that they set on fire. And they put forward resolutions to make a threat of secession, quote, if their demands were not met.
Because that's how you get compromise in government. You threaten to secede.
Yes, again and again.
Take my toys and go home. Again, sounds kind of familiar.
So it was around this time that Calhoun, and that was the committee that Calhoun was part of, by the way. Just want to emphasize that. So it was around this time that Calhoun would begin to express thoughts on slavery that have become the crux of what he is best known for. In the words of his biographer Elder, quote, he, i.e. Calhoun, defended not tyranny or power in the abstract, but self-determination, liberty, sovereignty, and the rights that his society awarded white men in relation to their property, including property in enslaved human beings. Again from Elder, quote, that his rights existed alongside and depended on slavery. A complete annihilation of another's rights was no contradiction at all to Calhoun. Slavery was part of who he was, a generational atrocity woven so seamlessly into the fabric of his identity that he could not imagine himself, his family, or the South without it. And so he would defend it.
I mean, to be fair, he is definitely not the only one, and he is very much a man of his time, but, ugh.
Yeah.
Oh, it's pretty disgusting.
Yeah.
And just how mealy now he's going, I don't support this, but I don't know this thing. Whatever, dude. Just if this is what you're down for, just come on out and say it.
Yeah.
Quit him hawing around.
Yeah.
And that's what he's been doing for so long. It just makes me really despise him.
Yeah. Now, in this new session of Congress, Calhoun would finally find himself on the same page with Jackson about something. I mean, that's a shocker. Because the president, in his annual message, called for, quote, a law banning incendiary material from circulation in the South by empowering the post office to censor the mail.
I mean, What could go wrong?
What could go wrong with that? Congress would ultimately, quote, uphold the post office's responsibility to deliver the mail. However, starting with the Jackson administration and continuing on until after the Civil War, the Postmasters General would do nothing to stop, quote, censorship at the local level. So basically, they knew it was happening. They turned a blind eye. So there was censorship of the mail.
What's different from censoring mail and burning it? I mean, come on.
He has a point.
Yeah. This would not be Calhoun's only work on behalf of the cause of slavery in this congressional session, however. Shortly after his fellow South Carolinian Representative James Henry Hammond did the same in the House, Calhoun on January 7, 1836, urged the Senate to refuse to accept abolitionist petitions. In early March, Calhoun delivered a full defense of the idea of rejecting abolitionist petitions, pointing out that other petitions had been denied for other reasons. He also used strawman arguments like, quote, would you accept a petition to abolish the Constitution or the Ten Commandments? Nobody was petitioning for either of those. That wasn't even a thing. Ultimately, the Senate would accept a compromise proposed by Senator James Buchanan, Democrat from Pennsylvania. The Senate would accept the petitions, but then automatically reject them without considering them. Calhoun abstained from the vote, which put this into place. And the gag rule, as it came to be known, would remain in place until 1850 in the Senate. In early February 1837, in a debate over receiving petitions calling for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia, Calhoun delivered what would come to be some of his most infamous remarks. All right, if the previous quotes weren't bad enough, but let me not be understood as admitting, even by implication, that the existing relations between the two races in the slaveholding states is an evil. Far otherwise, I hold it to be a good, as it has thus far proved itself to be to both, and will continue to prove so, if not disturbed by the fell spirit of abolition.
Or, the desire to live a free life.
Pretzel logic here.
Oh, just wait. Oh, goodness.
Oh, gosh. Okay, there's more.
Quote continues.
Jesus.
Never before has the black race of Central Africa, from the dawn of history to the present day, attained a condition so civilized and so improved, not only physically, but morally and intellectually. The relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good.
No.
Oh. Yeah.
That's
this guy's disgusting.
Awkward.
Not even just saying that it's good for the white enslavers. He's saying that the people who are being enslaved have never had it this good.
They just don't know it.
They just don't know it.
Oh, God. I always think I take this microphone stand and anyway. Okay.
Turn it into a cane?
Yeah. Jackson, can we borrow that cane?
The thing that always throws me with this guy is, okay, fine, you're a man of the time, you support slavery, you have plantation system in your blood. I get it. But couldn't you have tried to take the tack of some of your colleagues of, well, it's morally wrong, I'm not going to do anything about it, it'll just die out eventually? No, you decided white supremacists, full stop, it's better, we've improved their lives, despite all evidence to the contrary. And that, for me, just leaves a bitter taste in my mouth about Mr. Calhoun.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing, folks say, oh, well, that was the time. That was, he's a product of his time. No, even fellow enslavers were appalled by his comments. Senator William Cabell Reeves, Democrat from Virginia, replied to Calhoun that, quote, you shock the generous sentiments of human nature. You go counter to the common sense of mankind. You outrage the spirit of the age.
Damn.
That's tough.
This is a man who also enslaves people, is saying that you are way out of line here, dude.
You a nasty one, man. Nasty. Yuck. Yuck. Yeah, I know. I need a minute. Need a shower. Oh, God.
So, in 1837, the new President Van Buren called for a special session of Congress in September to address the crisis, the financial crisis that was going on in the nation.
Yeah.
So Calhoun left his home in South Carolina to return to Washington. The president put forward a proposal for an independent treasury, which would take the government funds out of the state banks that they had been deposited in when, of course, Jackson removed the deposits from the Bank of the United States. So they've been deposited in these state banks until now, and it would create a treasury system with branches around the nation that would hold the funds. Calhoun would come out as a supporter of the independent treasury system and thus aligned himself with Van Buren as he felt this was a healthy compromise between creating a new national bank and the pet banks that Jackson had favored. Calhoun believed that the independent treasury system would help stabilize the nation's currency. And so, again, it's all about this idea of currency. Calhoun, however, went further than Van Buren, and in a speech in the Senate advocated for, quote, new government notes that could circulate nationally and meet the constitutional duty to regulate the currency, allowing it to circulate at par throughout the country. So he didn't even want these notes to be based on gold or silver. Instead, he proposed that their value be based, quote, on supply and demand simply, which regulates the value of everything else. So this sounds very similar to paper money as it exists today.
Yeah.
This, of course, was not adopted. This was an idea that was far ahead of its time. Though Calhoun would help see through the independent treasury bill in the Senate, the House would not pass it for another 3 years. His support of the independent treasury, and by extension the Van Buren administration, would cost Calhoun the support of some erstwhile supporters, including his one-time protege, George McDuffie. By the summer of 1841, Calhoun was back in Washington, but would find it a different place than he had left. When he had last departed, a new president, William Henry Harrison, had been inaugurated. Now, another man, John Tyler, sat in his place. Harrison's untimely demise left a void in the political schema, and Calhoun's colleague and erstwhile opponent, Senator Henry Clay, Whig from Kentucky, aimed to fill the void. Clay started pushing through an aggressive agenda in the Senate, but while he had some victories like repealing the independent treasury, ultimately, President Tyler blocked other parts of his agenda, like establishing a new national bank. So, political crises loom in the horizon, a new administration, power vacuums, and then there's Calhoun. What's Calhoun going to do? We will have to find out in episode 3 of this 3-part series on the life of John C. Calhoun, where we talk about what happens when Calhoun and John Tyler.
Bum, bum, bum.
And with that, I thank you so much, Alicia. I thank you, Alex, for joining me for this perilous journey. I'd like to say it's not going to get even bumpier, but stay tuned for part 3.
I gotta say, it's been interesting. And next time I'm gonna make popcorn, and I'm gonna make sure I can mute my microphone so I can get one. And I'm gonna find a cane, just like, wave it at the sky whenever. Totally more disgusting things about this guy. Yikes!
Yes. Special thanks again to both Alicia of the Civics and Coffee podcast and Alex from the Vice Presidency Special Series for joining me for this episode. If you're not already listening to Civics and Coffee, the website is civicsandcoffee.com, or you can search for Civics and Coffee wherever you get your podcast. I'll have a link on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find other episodes of the Vice Presidency series where we're covering each VP from Adams to Vance as well as the Seat at the Table special series, where I'm joined by special guests to discuss cabinet members from Washington's first cabinet on. I'm also set on the narrative series to begin a new series on the Monroe presidency in the new year, so be sure to be on the lookout for that on the feed. Special thanks also to our patrons for all of your support, including our newest patron, Tyler. The financial support of our patrons ensures that I have the technological tools and research materials needed to do the deep dive into American presidential history to share with all of you. If you'd like to sign up as a patron, you can do so for as little as $1 per month at patreon.com/presidencies. If you'd rather not contribute on an ongoing basis, I do have a research wish list available at tinyurl.com/presidentiespodcast. Thank you so much to all the listeners who have sent books from the wish list to help ensure that my research is as comprehensive as possible. Thanks also to everyone who has left a rating and review to let folks know why they too should be listening to the Presidencies podcast. If you haven't already, it only takes a moment to do so. You can do so directly from my website, presidenciespodcast.com, and it really does make a huge difference, as well as it makes me feel good to know that folks are enjoying the podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.